All right, so we're going to be, and we'll be talking about the different proofs. And then once we get through the text of Aquinas, we'll be reading a paper on, which kind of gives another perspective on how to read Aquinas' 5 ways. So the common assumption is that when Thomas is writing his 5 proofs, is that there's 5 different arguments by which you can prove God exists. And that position, I believe, is totally credible, that each one is sufficient to stand on its own, that it proves God's existence. Another way of reading it, though, is looking at these 5 ways as like each one building on the next and kind of creating this, getting closer to an image of what God is, and then from that, the rest of the Summa goes into a philosophy of God. And we kind of hinted at that early in the course in regards to, you can prove that God is eternal. You can prove that he's not material, that he doesn't have a body, he's outside of time, all those sorts of things. And it all originates from these 5 proofs. All right, so prima pars, question 2, article 3, Summa 1, 2, 3. So the first objection has to do with the problem of evil, right? If God is infinite goodness, then there should be nothing but goodness. If goodness is extending to infinity, occupying everything, yet evil exists, so it appears that God does not exist. That is probably the most prevalent argument against the existence of God that you find in modern atheists, although it's typically not articulated that well by them. But that is the typical gripe. It's like, why would babies die from leukemia? Why would the Holocaust happen if God is good? That's the general run-of-the-mill argument. The second objection is that, posing the existence of God appears to be superfluous, because when human reason goes into investigating things, the cause of a lot of stuff is natural. You don't need necessarily supernatural to always account for the things that you see. And so for that reason, God doesn't exist. You can account for everything just based off of the way things are in nature, which is kind of the way people go, and they lean on, I believe in science, right? I'm not a superstitious religious person. And they kind of put up this contrast between scientific inquiry and religion. Again, Thomas writing in the High Middle Ages, these ideas have been around for a long time. So the fact that people would see this kind of New Age atheism as this new intellectual movement is kind of silly, because you can see in the Summa, essentially their arguments have been around for thousands of years. So it's not like they are any more enlightened necessarily, or that they realize more in depth, deeper truths than the philosophers of the Middle Ages, were able to wrestle with as well. Do you have a hand up? No? Okay. All right, so on the contrary to all this, it is said in the person of God, I am who am. So God said he exists, he exists. Now that's not the actual argument, because you'd be able to point out that it's kind of circular reasoning, right? But that God's revelation of I am who am is going to be very important in Thomas's synthesis of faith and reason, right? Because what God's doing is he's revealing that I am being, I am existence. And the way Thomas is going to get to God is going to be following that path of metaphysical existence. So I answer that the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. This first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion. Whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood which is potentially hot to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e., that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they're put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other. And this everyone understands to be God. All right, so if there's going to be changing from potency to act, you have to have the first mover. Because if you remove the first in a line of sequential cause and effect, well, then the other effects don't happen. And so that's what he means when he says you can't go on to infinity. So while this is warming up, I'll put this on the board in a second. But let's say A causes B and B causes C. Follow that? If A does not exist, will either B or C exist? No, they will not. Okay. Now, the reason why the cause of motion can't go on to infinity is because if it goes on to infinity, what do you not have in an infinite series going either way?
Start.
You don't have that first. A does not exist.
You also have an infinite number of A's.
Yeah, I mean, would you call it an infinite number of A's or an infinite number of, like,
Or you could
A1?
just say A is infinitely on either side. There's just an infinite number of stuff between us and A.
Right, which can't be crossed, right? Because you can't cross an infinity.
Yeah.
In the way you're going with it, yeah. So that, the understanding what Thomas means by infinite regress, especially in regards to cause and effect, is pretty crucial for understanding, the arguments he's making here in the Summa as a whole. So A causes B, B causes C. You remove A, everything else does not go into motion, right? But if you said, well, if you had, motion that had an infinite regression of causes, you would just be going, like, I don't know, let's just say negative A was then caused by negative B. You can just keep adding back, but you have to have the first domino, so to speak, fall in order for the others to then proceed forward. And so if your question's still burning about energy and all that, we'll get to that with the eternity. But hopefully this explanation in terms of just looking at a simple series of cause-effect chains, you need to have a first cause to then begin a chain. Sam.
Can I go to Mr. Ryan's?
Sure. All right. The second way is from the nature of the efficient cause. In the worldist sense, we find there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. For so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Now, in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity, because in all efficient causes following an order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediary intermediate cause. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, which everyone gives the name of God. So, it's just like the argument from motion, but he's kind of bringing you along in a pedagogical step, so to speak. So, what's everyone more familiar with, motion or philosophical terms about causality, efficient and final cause? Motion is the more immediate experience for people, okay? And then in the second way, he's abstracting the language to then go in terms of causality, all right? And so you need to have a first efficient cause. It's the exact same thing as what a first mover is. A first mover is, in fact, the efficient cause for the motion that then happens. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are possible to be and not to be. But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which is possible not to be at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. All right, so there has to be something whose existence is as necessary as, say, 2 + 2 = 4 is a necessary truth. You're never going to get away from that, right? Everything else in the material world, though, doesn't carry that level of necessity. This desk, it exists, but it doesn't have to exist. It can get smelted down to something else. You definitely did not have to exist, all right? In the terms of natural generation and decay, there will be a time when you don't exist or your body doesn't exist. So what Thomas is saying is that from the perspective of eternity, all right, if something is possible to be and not to be, there will be a time when it will be, and there will be a time when it will not be. However, everything that we see is rather contingent. It is not necessary. Its existence isn't necessary. Its existence is simply contingent, right? And so because of that, what Thomas is saying is that if you go back far enough with contingent being, there'd be a time where nothing existed. And if nothing exists, well then, it's not like things can just spontaneously come from nothing. Because that's a violation of metaphysics. Nothing can come from nothing. All right, and so this is his argument from the necessity of being, the third way. Let's continue reading on. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Now, it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another. This has been already proved in regard to efficient causes. Right? You can see he's kind of building up on his last way. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God. All right, so first mover, first efficient cause, that which exists and is necessary to exist. This is the definition of what you call God. All right, the fourth way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings, there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like. But more and less are predicated of different things, according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maxim, as a thing is said to be hotter, according as it is more nearly resembles that which is hottest. So that there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is uttermost being. For those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being, as is written in Metaphysics by Aristotle. Now, the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus. As fire, which is the maximum of heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore, there must be also something which is to all beings the cause of their being goodness, in every other perfection. And this we call God. All right, so this one, it's no longer, it's kind of branching off. This one, it stands more on its own. And it's taking a look at perfection, all right, or the grades of being. This is the fourth way. And he says that if there are perfections that exist, those perfections are always caused by a higher perfection, metaphysically. And so eventually, if you keep climbing higher and higher as the cause of perfections, you're going to ultimately get to that which is most perfect. And that thing which is the most perfect is what men refer to as God. Most good, the perfection of existence entirely. Lastly, the fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their always acting, or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Hence, it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, do they achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So, in the natural world, the observation I think that Aristotle makes is that the irrational nature almost acts rationally. All right? Birds are not rational creatures, but everything in their instincts is directed towards their proper functioning, right? Like flying south for winter is essential for them, and they just do it. And then trees, okay, in the way that they grow in soil that's habitable to them and they're able to reproduce, and there's other trees that grow, they just do it on their own, and they seem to be acting for an end, right? And it's with like this ruthless efficiency that gets observed in nature. And so the observation that's being made is nature, from what you can observe, acts with a purpose. And something can only act for a purpose unless it's being directed, right? And that person who directs nature is what men refer to as God. Okay, so after these five things, have we gotten anything close to like a Trinity or a God that loves you?
No.
Or it's going to save the Israelites? No. Okay, so this is the knowledge you can arrive to of God, of a supreme being, just by observations in the natural world. Okay, and there's a lot you can figure out about the supreme being, but in terms of a personal God who cares about you and all that stuff, that type of knowledge is something that's only given through revelation. Okay. So let's look at replies to the objections, unless you guys have any questions. Okay. Reply to objection 1. As Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is the part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. All right, so that is one of the tenets that you have in Christianity, is that God always brings good out of evil. And so even though evil exists, all right, it's not in violation, or you can't even say evil exists, right? It's a privation. Evil's there. Okay, but evil being there, it is going to be overcome by the infinite goodness. Any bad thing you do eventually produces a greater good by God. Okay? And as St. Paul says, that doesn't mean you just go start sinning, because God will start producing greater goods out of it. Right? Because if you do good things, then God probably brings about better goods out of the good things. But if there's something bad, God's infinite goodness always kind of like circumvents it. Like Joseph sold into Egypt by his brothers. God brings greater good out of it by then saving people from the famine. Yes.
What's the greater good out of hell?
Out of hell?
Mm-hmm.
Is hell an evil?
I would say it's definitely not as good.
Well, hang on. So just spitballing here. Some saints say like the fires of hell or that like hell is located in Christ's heart. And the fires of hell are ignited by God's love. And that's what they can't stand. Because people in hell do not want to be with God. They've made that choice. And yeah, it's bad that they're deprived of the beatific vision. But the greater good, you can also say, is, well, God's justice is then exercised, which is a good. And his providence and wisdom is also made manifest, particularly at the second coming, at the general judgment. So those, like, even like Hitler roasting in hell for the rest of eternity is in some way like giving glory to God and showing that like justice can't be escaped.
But those people still hate God, though.
Sure.
Is that okay?
They still hate God, but their contribution of hatred compared to the actual glory that they're giving him, that like, oh wow, look at God's justice with their ongoing hatred, it's still out magnifying that. Now, it's also, it's not ideal for Hitler to be in hell. Okay? Hitler's only in hell because God's permitting him to be in hell. So the distinction Thomas makes with permissive will, he permits within God's will, like God wills that all men go to heaven, but within his will, he also permits men to make their own choices. And so within those choices that men make, it's also worked out, though, that the greater good is always going to come out from the evil. It would have been better if he just went to heaven. But there's that privation of Hitler roasting, but God's still going to manifest some good that's greater than Hitler's privation. Okay. Objection 2. This was how to do with, like, you can just look at nature. You don't need to suppose God. Since nature works for a determinate end under the direction of a higher agent, whatever is done by nature must needs be traced back to God as its first cause. So also whatever is done voluntarily must also be traced back to some higher cause other than human reason or will, since these things can change or fail. For all things that are changeable and capable of defect must be traced back to an immovable and self-necessary first principle, as was shown in the body of the article. All right, so it's like, okay, yeah, you say, maybe people thousands of years ago thought God like snapped fingers and stuff was there, and we like do our physics, and we now have theory of like a Big Bang. It's like, okay, you can put all the natural causes in place. You can argue for, evolution from T-Rexes to chickens, okay? and that's the cause of the chickens. But when you're going through the order of nature, you still have established as that first efficient cause, that highest being whose infinite existence that ordains the laws of nature to them. Okay? So like I think like one of the theories of physicists is that the Big Bang happened because the laws of gravity and the nuclear forces, and I forget the other fourth force. Is it like electromagnetic or something? They just like had a blip. They like didn't operate for some reason, and then the universe was created. And it's like, okay, where does the law of gravity come from? Like, you still kind of need to push back. Like, there's a cause that then causes those things to exist in the first place. Even as weird as it is to think of just four laws hanging out and then having a blip, which would then cause matter. All right, so now we're going to move on to the paper, which is kind of go over, try to articulate. Oh, look at that ugly typo. The block quote is off. The looking at Thomas's fifth way of, which was like arguing God is the orderer of the universe and how that is what men call God. So let's jump into it. It's in a little bit more vernacular, but it's going to rehash a lot of the five ways, but in less scholastic language. So in Prima Pars, Article 2, Question 3, St. Thomas Aquinas goes over 5 proofs for the existence of God. In his fifth proof, or fifth way, Thomas gives the following demonstration. I just quoted the fifth way. We just read it. In this proof, Thomas is moving from the noticeable effects of ordered, unintelligent things to their proper cause. An intelligent being who has caused unintelligent things to be ordered. Some would hold, though, that this proof is not satisfactory because it assumes God's existence as a perfect being and jumps unnecessarily to the conclusion of God as the source of all design. One way to overcome this objection is to view the fifth way from a different angle. Taking all Thomas's 5 ways together as a single ongoing proof provides no doubt that God is the designer of all natures of unintelligent beings. The first way provides a proof of a being that is an unmoved mover. The second way points to a being who is the first efficient cause. The third way points to a being whose existence is not contingent but necessary itself. The fourth way points to a being who is the source of all grades of perfection. With the understanding of these other 4 ways, a more complete picture can be made of God as the intelligent designer. Taking the first 3 ways, we can form the concept of a necessary being who is an unmoved mover that is the first efficient cause of everything. The reason these 3 can be concluded as one being is because whatever is necessary in and of itself can only move if it is its own principle of motion, or if it's moved by another. If it's moved by another, then that being is either contingent or necessary. If it is contingent, then it would be dependent on a necessary being. A necessary being causing a contingent being is a kind of motion. Thus, the argument of the contingent being moving a necessary being has come to be circular and cannot be the case. If the necessary being is moved by another necessary being, then that other necessary being must itself be moved by another, or be an unmoved mover. This can continue on indefinitely and must terminate in a being that is both necessary and an unmoved mover. Using the principle of parsimony, there is no reason to assume a multiplicity of necessary beings other than the one unmoved mover whose being is necessary. The principle of parsimony, that's a reference to you don't, it's like taking scissors and removing unnecessary explanations. And so this was typically done by scholastic philosophers where, like ancients who would talk about God creating the world, but then they would go say, well, more like God created angels. And then those angels create other angels. And then those angels create other angels. And then those angels create the world. And so if you follow the cause-effect chain, it ultimately comes from God. But the intermediary causes would be the angels. Okay? And I forget the name of the philosopher. I don't think his name was Parsimony. Could have been. But he was like, this is just unnecessary. It got to the point where philosophers were like making up reasons to just kind of multiply the intermediary levels between God and creation. It's like, look, when you're just focusing on this kind of inquiry, you should not be multiplying causes unnecessarily. Yeah, Michael. Sure. From the same line of reasoning, it also naturally follows that this being would be the first efficient cause of everything, because causing something is a kind of movement. The fourth way shows how all perfections of being must flow from one being. Again, because there's an unmoved mover whose existence is necessary and is the first efficient cause, this being must also be the source of all perfections. For if it were not the source of perfection, then it must receive its perfection from somewhere outside of itself. To receive a perfection that was to be the effect of a cause. It has been shown that the necessary unmoved mover is the first cause of everything. Thus, this being must be the cause of its own perfections. Because it is also the prime mover and efficient cause, it is also the source of all perfections. For nothing can be the source of a perfection unless it already possesses the perfection. Finally, this being must also be the cause of order in the universe. For if this being caused chaos, which is the opposite of order, then there would have to be another being that caused order, which is something you do find in some like mythology and some ancient philosophers, where matter is created, but then another god comes in, or another being, and he kind of puts all the matter of creation into order and makes sense out of the whole chaos. This ordering being would have to have been caused by the unmoved mover. This being, though, would also have to have received its intelligence as an orderer from the unmoved mover, because it has been shown that all perfections come from the unmoved mover. This unmoved mover must also then contain the perfection of intelligence and order if he's going to give it to some subservient being that is an intelligent orderer. From this, we can necessarily conclude that the unmoved mover is, at the very least, a removed cause from the order that is seen in the world. Again, using the principle of parsimony, there's no reason to suggest a multiplicity of orderers, and we can rightly conclude that there is a being that is necessary, unmoved, the primary cause, source of perfection, order of the universe. It is this being which men call God. All right, so any questions on any of the 5 ways? Which of the 5 ways is easiest for you to grasp?
I'd say the mover one, but then God would just have to be there, like always and forever, eternally, to be the first mover.
Yeah. That's how we're going to get to the eternity. Because, yeah. Dominic, you said mover. Yeah. Isaiah? Mover? Michael? You just said sure. But mover was the one you had the objection to last week.
Yeah, it's the easiest to comprehend, but it's the one, but because it's the easiest one that I can comprehend, it's the one I have the most objections to.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I got you. Ella?
4th one.
4th one? Okay. Interesting. What makes, so explain to me the 4th one.
One about being the first cause, and like the source of all goodness.
Mm-hmm. So it's like your apprehension of goodness in the world, and a realization that there are things that are greater and less good, and that it all has to point towards something. Because if they didn't point towards something, then it's not good. Like there's something lacking in their own definition as good, unless they're pointing towards that higher thing. Cool. Okay, what I'm gonna hand out to you guys now is an old study guide from a final. Called Fog. foundation for philosophy of God. And this is what we'll be going over tomorrow.
We don't have class tomorrow.